Well, kia ora everybody, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, no mai, haere mai, and let's start our webinar today with a karakia. Whakarongo, whakarongo, whakarongo akeo, ki te tangi a te tui, tui, tui tui a. Tui a I runga, tui a I raro, tui a I waho, tui a I roto, ka rongo te pō, ka rongo te au, ka au, ka au, ka awatia. Ti hei, mauri ora. Tēnā koutou katoa. No ingarangi me kotirana o ku tipuna, I tipua I raru te raukura o te Ātiawa I Pito Oni. Ko Holly Walker tōku ingoa, no Pito Oni a hau, no reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everybody to our webinar, a joint webinar between the Helen Clark Foundation, Mahi Arongo, and the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research. And thank you so very, very much for joining us today. I've just started with a karakia that asks us to listen to the call of the tui, a call that unites us, a call that stitches things together and strengthens the web of connections between people and the natural world. And then just introduce myself, explaining that my ancestors come from England and Scotland, that I grew up under the feathers of the Te Ātiawa people here in Petone, where I live and work, and that my name is Holly Walker. So I work for Mahi Arongo, the Helen Clark Foundation. I'm the Deputy Director and an Associate Fellow there. And we're a public policy think tank. We're based at Auckland University of Technology, and we're founded on the values of our patron, our former New Zealand Prime Minister, Helen Clark. And we're delighted to be partnering with NZIER today for this webinar about minimum wage policy. It's a very timely discussion to be having in Aotearoa right now, given that our minimum wage is due to increase next week. And so in a moment, I'm going to facilitate a discussion with our panelists for about 25 minutes before opening things up to you as our audience for questions. So if you do have questions that you would like to put to the panel, please use the Q&A function on Zoom to enter those questions. I'll be able to see those, and I'll put as many as I can to our panelists. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with Zoom webinars now, but just a couple of housekeeping things quickly, just in case. So as our audience, all of your cameras and microphones are turned off. So please don't worry if you're in a noisy environment or if you are vacuuming topless like the Hamilton Deputy Mayor was this week. We can't see you, we can't hear you, but that doesn't mean that you can't be part of this webinar. We definitely want your participation. So please put your questions in that Q&A function, and you are also free to use the chat function to talk to the other attendees, to introduce yourself, or to share useful resources and links if you have any. And we'll drop, I see Paul has just done that, a link to the NZIER Insights paper in there on this topic that you can download and read after the webinar. And the chat's also the place to put any technical questions that you might have if you're having issues with accessing the information or anything like that. But just please be aware that as panelists and as myself as the chair, we're not monitoring that chat. So if you want us to see the questions, please put them in the Q&A box. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce our panelists, Peter Wilson and Julie Fry. Peter is a principal economist at NZIER, and Julie is an associate with the Institute based in New York. And together, they are the authors of this very useful insights paper, The Tale of Goldilocks and the Three Fears About the Minimum Wage. They're also two of our most experienced, most influential economists, I think, that are working in New Zealand at the moment. And as a team, they have produced scores of extremely useful research on a range of economic topics related to migration, productivity. So if you're interested and well-being, how these things connect to well-being. So if you're interested in these topics, please do check out their research. But I'll now hand briefly to Peter to introduce NZIER for our audience as well. Peter, over to you.
Thanks, Holly, and kia ora, everyone. It's great to be here today with you. NZIER is a charity based in Wellington with an office in Auckland, and our charitable purpose is to provide material to the New Zealand public to inform and educate them about important economic issues. We finance that through our commercial consultancy, but the project that we've worked on today, the Insight into the Minimum Wage, was funded out of our public good program, and we've used it to raise some points about important issues. And yes, I'd encourage you all to go to the website where you'll see all of our public good stuff is made public for everyone, and a lot of our commercial stuff is also available. But I'm very much looking forward to today. Thanks, Holly.
Thanks, Peter. And I can endorse that recommendation. As I said before, there's just a huge resource of really useful information there for people who are interested in these things. Okay, so let's get on to our topic for today, which is about the minimum wage. And it's an intriguing title that you've given to the Insights paper, and which we chose to use for the webinar today as well, invoking the story of Goldilocks. So, you know, the implication is the minimum wage is a Goldilocks policy. We want to set it not too high, not too low, just right. But instead of the three bears in the story, we have the three fears. So I thought perhaps to kick off, it might be useful to tell us what those are. What are the three fears about the minimum wage that you're referring to in the title and in this paper? Peter, would you like to kick off with those?
Okay, thanks, Holly. The three fears we've got is the first is that the setting of the minimum wage introduces a political element into the labour market in New Zealand. The second fear that people have is that the minimum wage can have a negative impact on employment. And the third fear is that the minimum wage isn't high enough to address real social policy issues.
Okay, so I think we'll work through those as we go during our conversation today, and perhaps by the end of the webinar we'll have a sense of whether any or all of those fears are well-founded. But maybe let's just take a step back to begin with, so that I know we've got a range of people on the call today, from very experienced economists perhaps to just interested members of the public. So let's establish some kind of common understandings about what we're talking about here. In the paper, you talk about the fact that at the moment, our minimum wage is the highest in real terms that it's been since at least 1946. So Julie, maybe can you just take us through, what are we talking about when we talk about a real minimum wage, and how have those levels varied over time in Aotearoa New Zealand? And I think we've got a graph that we can put up on the screen to illustrate this.
So the real minimum wage adjusts the amount that's paid per hour for the effects of inflation. And when the Minimum Wage Act was introduced in 1945, the male minimum wage was 2 shillings and 9 pence an hour. So that converts to, in decimal currency, about 28 cents per hour. And something that cost that in 1945 would be worth about $11.50 today. So if we look at this graph, we can see that the minimum wage currently is the highest that it's been since this data series began in 1945. So that's the first kind of piece of context. The minimum wage in real terms is currently very high.
Essentially, it's its purchasing power. It's the highest it's ever been currently.
Correct.
And it is, of course, due to increase next week, so to $21.20. Okay, and Peter, maybe another sort of useful piece of contextual information is some information about who receives the minimum wage in Aotearoa New Zealand. Is it evenly distributed across our age groups, for example, or who are the demographics that are most likely to be receiving the minimum wage?
Yeah, the minimum wage in New Zealand is shared across the age distribution. About half the people who are receiving it are aged over 25, and half are under 25. A large number who get it are in the 16 to 19 bracket, and that's about a quarter of the people. But they make up about 6% of the overall population. So yes, we do see it concentrated in the low range, but it's very important to remember that a lot of adults get the minimum wage, and that makes New Zealand a bit different from some other countries, and particularly the US. In the United States, a lot of minimum wage earners are actually younger people working part-time, students and the like, whereas in New Zealand, it is paid to a lot of people who are working in full-time jobs.
So would it be fair to say that a lot of young people, including teenagers who are in work, are receiving the minimum wage, but that doesn't mean that most So most young people who work receive the minimum wage, but not most people who are on the minimum wage are young people.
Absolutely, that you've got it absolutely right. So that's an important thing to think about in terms of the well-being of people receiving it. And again, a lot of the American commentary has said that, well, the minimum wage isn't really important because it's something that young people get and they grow out of it. They might start on the minimum wage, but they progress up, whereas in New Zealand, there's some less evidence of that happening, that there are people on the minimum wage for a reasonable amount of time.
Right. And so, yeah, and some people may actually spend quite a large chunk of their working life in receipt of the minimum wage. Okay. And Peter, this is another question I'll direct to you before coming back to Julie, which is to talk about inflation, very topical conversation at the moment as well. That's also at a historically high level. And so if we're raising the minimum wage, which we're about to do, and we have a conversation in a minute about how to set the wage at the best rate, are there risks of raising minimum wages during a time of high inflation? Do they end up getting simply passed on as higher prices and contributing to inflation?
Indeed, and that's one of the fears people have about the minimum wage, that it can fuel increases in prices that then get passed on, as you say, and then you can get into a cycle of more wages leading to higher prices, and then workers want higher wages. So that is a real concern to have. The evidence again, a lot of this is overseas, is that not all the minimum wage is passed on in prices. Some of it goes to profits. But also importantly, one of the things we talk about is that increases in minimum wage can increase productivity as employers think about ways to work with their staff more effectively. And so if the wage increases are leading to higher productivity, that would lessen your concerns about the inflationary effects, because there is something real happening in the economy as well. The other thing you need to think about, particularly in New Zealand at the moment, and this links back to our migration work, is that the border is still closed, and the labour market is the tightest it's been for a very long time. And so, demand for workers is high. We are starting to see wages filter through, wage increases. But if they're being linked to productivity, then I'd be less concerned about the inflationary impacts.
Okay. Well, there's some interesting questions in there around how we ensure that we are setting the policy in the right way to avoid those risks and maximise the potential benefits. So, Julie, let's talk a little bit about, I guess, the effects of the minimum wage. Shall we talk about one of those fears? So the fear around the idea that increasing the minimum wage may have a detrimental impact on jobs and lead to job losses. What's the evidence? What does the evidence suggest, both internationally and here in Aotearoa New Zealand, about that particular fear or that impact of minimum wage increases?
It's interesting because, anyone who's done first year economics, someone tells you put the price up, you'll expect demand to fall, right? And that's just not what happens. It's not what happens in migration when you get more people coming in. It's not what's happening in terms of the minimum wage. And that's because when you put the minimum wage up, most people who are earning minimum wages aren't very well paid by definition, and they spend most of what they earn, and that boosts demand. So in addition to firms and employers having to pay more for their employees, they're getting a boost to the demand from the consumer side. So David Card and Alan Kruger did some initial work in New Jersey around people working in the fast food industry, and found that you paid people more, raised the minimum wage, and then they would end up going out and buying fast food. And so you get this kind of demand effect. But I mean, the other sort of interesting factor is that it may not be that employment is where employers make their adjustments if there's an increase in the minimum wage. Peter's already talked about you might see productivity increasing. I mean, there's a lot of variation in the literature. There isn't really a one size fits all conclusion. I mean, on one particular point is on training. Some studies show that in response to employers paying people more, they are prepared to train them so that they are getting more bang for buck. So some people will train people, more when the minimum wage goes up. Others will have to economize because things are too tight and have to cut back on training. So there's very, very different results in different situations. But the overall message from the New Zealand studies and the US studies as well, and other international ones, is that for moderate levels of the minimum wage, there's generally not very large impacts on employment. And I guess the interesting question for New Zealand right now is that, I mean, our minimum wage is a very high proportion of our median wage. It's about 65% of the median wage in 2020. Compare that with the US figure of less than 30%, around 29%, I believe, at the same time. So in terms of as a share of median wages, our minimum wage is high. So that's something we should be thinking about in terms of how comfortable we are increasing it going forward.
Okay, I'd like to talk about that in a second in relation to, I suppose, the political decisions and that first sphere that Peter mentioned around the political motivations of where we set the minimum wage. But just to finish the thought around productivity, Julie, you mentioned there that training is one way in which the minimum wage going up can sometimes result in increased productivity. Are there others? What are some policy implications for people setting the minimum wage to think about in terms of encouraging productivity gains rather than job losses when they're making that decision?
I mean, employers who are told that they have to pay their employees more, they might invest in capital so that they can get more value out of people. They might raise their expectations of the people that they're bringing in. They might look to hire different people. They might say, if I have to pay this amount of money, I might go for more experienced people. So you can see all of these kinds of choices potentially having productivity impacts as well.
Okay, thank you. I think we've got another graph to put on the screen now that will give us some context for this next question. So Julie, as you were finishing off your previous answer, you talked about how in New Zealand, comparatively, we have a very high minimum wage, and that's in part a political decision based on the current government's policy around minimum wage. And we can see from this next graph that things tend to change quite a lot in minimum wage policy depending on who is in government. So Peter, do you want to talk us briefly through what we're looking at on this slide here?
Yes, our candy stripe document. What we've got there is the highest minimum wage paid throughout that period. So it's the male and then the adult. And the stripes there are political periods. And you can see that through the long period of national governments and a bit of Labor in the up to 1970, the minimum wage was drifting down. It got boosted significantly by the Kirk government, then declined through the Muldoon years, boosted again by the Lonnie Palmer government, and then declined through the Bolger years, then increased again, and on you go. So we can see clearly that political dimension, that the rate does tend to go up a bit more in Labor administrations than in national. But the exceptions that prove the rule, the Bolger government abolished the youth minimum wage and just made it a minimum wage for everyone. That was a significant increase for younger workers. And then the Key government, as you can see there, particularly at the end of its period, it was increasing the real minimum wage quite significantly. But you can see that political dimension and the way the Minimum Wage Act, the legislation works. The minister's got very wide discretion. All they have to do is review it once a year, and then they can do what they like. And one of the things we would suggest in the paper that we might like to think about putting in some more, hopefully bipartisan guidance around what things the minister should think about when setting the minimum wage, rather than leave it just to their discretion.
So it's a really interesting graph, this one, and you're right, is clearly a trend is apparent. And I suppose the question I have for you, Julie, is why does it matter? You know, if we can see, broadly speaking, and as you say, Peter, there's exceptions from time to time, but broadly speaking, Labor government or Labor-led governments tend to increase the minimum wage more than national-led governments do. Why is that a problem? Why is this one of the fears that the paper is framed around? And what's the detrimental or problematic impact of this trend?
I guess when you look at a lot of our other kind of economic frameworks that we have around things like tax policy or price stability, there's general agreement. So when a change of government occurs, businesses, consumers don't need to be thinking, oh, okay, we're going into a period where this is going to go up a lot, or we're going to go into a period where this is going to go down a lot. There's a consistency and a certainty that makes decision making and investment easier, and just having it be a little bit less volatile would be helpful for that.
And it's also how workers and potential workers think about the minimum wage, because one of the important decisions that people have got to make is, do they stay at school, do they get more education, or do they go into the workforce? And some of the early work in New Zealand was showing that lifting the youth minimum wage actually encouraged people to leave school, and unfortunately some of them went to unemployment. So having potential workers having some certainty about the track of wages going forward means that they can make their very important decisions about participating in education based on a more certain view of what wages are going to do going forward.
Interesting. Okay, I just want to flag to people that in a couple of minutes, I'm going to start taking some questions from our Q&A. So I see we've got some in there already, which is great. If you do have any questions, drop them in there now, and you have the ability to go and have a look at what other people have been asking. You can like the ones that you're interested in hearing the answer to, which will bump them up to the top of our list and increase the chances of us getting to put them to the panelists. So please have a look in there, put your question in, or like the ones you're interested in. And before we do that, I suppose I want to turn now to this question of all this being the case, all these factors we've talked about, the political factors, the employment factors, how do we set the minimum wage appropriately? And this relates to the third fear of, if it's set too low, it could have detrimental impacts on well-being. So Julie, what do we know about how much the minimum wage currently impacts on the well-being of people on very low incomes in Aotearoa, New Zealand?
So what the minimum wage does is it provides a kind of like a floor. It provides sort of protection for people who are vulnerable, who may not be able to advocate very strongly in the labour market themselves. And so it gives this kind of robust, like, baseline level of wages. So for people who are not in a position to advocate strongly, it has that value. But I think we want to be quite careful in terms of thinking. I mean, it's important that we prevent exploitation for people who are vulnerable, but we don't want to be thinking that the minimum wage can do more than it is capable of doing. So you don't get annoyed at a hammer because it can't cut a straight line. You go get a pair of scissors, right? So, I mean, minimum wages, they will not necessarily help with things like income inequality. They won't necessarily raise income for families. There are other tools that might be much more effective at doing that. Things like working for families. They won't help. Really, they won't help with the current situation in the housing market, which needs to be addressed, and in terms of the root causes of housing supply needing to be fixed. So when we think of minimum wages as providing a floor to prevent exploitation, that's a very solid way that they can improve the well-being of people who are on low incomes, but we shouldn't be expecting them to solve other problems that they're not really designed to fix.
And I think it's very important to remember that life on the minimum wage is really tough. And even a family with multiple members working at the minimum wage is still going to be doing it very tough, particularly in, as Julie says, with the housing market in Auckland. So it's not a cure for lots of those problems, and that's one of the issues in terms of the not too high, not too low range. You want to make sure that it is providing that floor, that it's stopping exploitation, and it's providing a minimum ability for people to buy the bare necessities. But it is bare necessities territory, and I don't think we should ever think that by increasing the minimum wage we can really address income distribution or child poverty. That's not what it's good at.
And suggest, as you say, Julie, that there are a number of other policy areas that we need to be thinking about in tandem, and I'm sure we'll get into some of those as we get into our Q&A. So I suppose finally, you mentioned there, Peter, the range, the not too low, not too high, just right, Goldilocks range. You give that in the paper at 18, somewhere between $18 to $25. Maybe just tell us a little bit about the thinking that led to the selection of that particular range. And given that we know that the living wage is currently set at $22.75, I suppose a very pertinent policy question is, could we safely and appropriately fix the minimum wage at that living wage of $22.75 and wherever it happens to move to in the future?
I might start off. We used a very sophisticated econometric tool called eyeballing to determine that range, and we freely admit in the paper that it's not a scientific study, and we looked at things like the unemployment benefit, working families, the state of the job market, and we came to that view that range of about $18 to $25 seems to be, if you like, the safe range within which a government, with the current amount of information they've got, could work. But the concerns we've got is that the setting of the minimum wage, it's based on work that NB does, which is pretty mainstream, but I would think a bit narrow. Their model, for example, will always say that if you put up the minimum wage, employment will fall. I mean, it's just axiomatic. That's how the equations are written. They don't have that David Card demand side thing that Julie talked about in them. So we would certainly hope that in time, and perhaps quickly, the government could start thinking about some more empirical work on the real effects of the minimum wage in in New Zealand, because a lot of the studies do come from America, and you've got to be very careful that that's a very, very, very different labour market to what we've got here. It's a different economy. So I think
just really nicely answered, Peter, the first audience question I was going to put to you, which was exactly this. So talking about concerns being raised about MB's current modelling and the criteria that they're using there. And that apparently produced an estimate that it could lead to the loss of, this year's rise could lead to the loss of 6,400 jobs. So you've basically said there you've got some issues with that modelling, and you'd like other factors to be included. Is that essentially the problem, that it's largely based on overseas models that don't really apply here in New Zealand? What are the other issues potentially with the model that they're using?
I think that's the main one. I mean, to be fair to our friends in MB, this is hard stuff, and it's very hard to model. But perhaps one of the other things that the department could be looking at is just a wider range of studies looking at various things, and just giving ministers and members of the public just a fuller picture of what happened, what the minimum wage does. And one thing in particular, it might sound trivial, but there's not really a consensus in New Zealand about what is the minimum wage for. It does lots of things, and different people think it's to relieve poverty, or it's to stop exploitation, it's to encourage people into the employment. So I think just some better thinking about what it's for, and certainly in our view, it's it should be used for a narrow range of things rather than being the universal cure for everything. So having that in the mix would be important.
Mm. Okay, thank you. The next question, which relates to that one, speaking of universality, is, I suppose, the relationship of the minimum wage to the idea of, for example, a universal basic income. So it's not the same as that, because as you've talked in your previous answers, it only applies to a very particular section of the population. But Julie, could it have a role to play in a suite of wider measures designed to create a universal basic income? And the question that Sean asks here is, when you think about basic income, what comes to mind, and how is that likely to, or it's a question about association, I think. So when we start talking about basic incomes, what pops into your head, and how will that association potentially impact people's perception, based on the idea that basic income advocates acknowledge that it's compatible with the living wage? So there's a lot in there, but Julie, what's a response to some of that stuff around the role of the minimum wage in the providing a wider basic income, or how politically, I suppose, and perceptually, how that plays out?
I mean, when I think about these issues, I think about how over time things have changed. I think about how my mum, retired in her 70s a few years ago, having never been paid more than the minimum wage her entire life, working in retail and in horticulture. And during the period when she was married to my dad, that was not an issue, because she was a secondary income earner. So, this is the 1970s, everything held together okay. When she was a single parent, trying to manage on that, it was different. So I think when we start talking about universal basic incomes and minimum wages for individuals, we need to think about where people are situated in society, because there are circumstances in which things are adequate, and there are circumstances in which the same amounts are not adequate. And so when I sort of look at these figures that are supposed to be one size fits all, I immediately think of situations in which things that look on the surface to be okay actually are or aren't, depending on those deeper kinds of issues. So that's what I'd be interested in looking at, things that fit the circumstances that people are actually facing, rather than just kind of a mythical individual single person, because that's not really what most households in New Zealand are. Peter, do you have anything to add?
I think, thanks, Julie. One thing that's important to remember is who pays the minimum wage versus who would pay a universal basic income. It's the employer pays the minimum wage, and so for the government, from the government's point of view, fiscally it's quite cheap. In fact, the tax take goes up when the minimum wage increases, because it is taxable. Whereas a UBI under various different types of that thing would be paid for by taxpayers through the transfer system. So the simplest one is the government will just give everyone, $20,000 a year, and then just tax under the progressive income tax. But that would have a very high fiscal cost. So I think that's a very important thing. And one of the concerns I've got is that the moral hazard on the government is that it doesn't pay the minimum wage to many people. And so the fiscal impact on the ministers are sitting there, and when they're getting their advice from the Treasury, they say, well, will this cost the government much? Oh, no, because we don't have many minimum wage workers, and we'll get some more income tax, so it gets a free tick. Whereas some of the universal basic income things would perhaps do the same thing, but would come at a higher cost to the government. So we need to think about those, who pays is very important in all this stuff.
Is there I suppose a middle ground there in the concept of a guaranteed minimum income? So looking across policy and a range of as you say, setting of minimum wage policy, and then also looking at the types of assistance that government is providing to people in different situations, guaranteeing some consistency across that, and a floor of low income or lower income under which we say it's not acceptable for people. Do you see a role for minimum wage policy working?
Undoubtedly, and I think that's a very important point Holly, that look, we shouldn't just see the minimum wage in isolation. It's part of the mix. It's part of what's happening. It's part of what happens in the economy. It's one tool the government has got to address its issues. And what we'd really like the government to be doing is thinking very much about, don't just do the minimum wage in isolation. Think about some wider things. And particularly that point Julie made is that targeting versus universalism, again, a big topic. In New Zealand, we've tended of late to be a bit more targeted. And so working for families, for example, is targeted but very effective at increasing the incomes of low wage people with children who are working. Whereas the minimum wage is a bit, it's a bit more scattergun, and it does help the the student who's going to be earning a lot of money as a doctor, or probably should say private sector accountant, will get it, and they probably don't need it quite as much. So putting it it's a very important point. Put this into a context of a whole range of things, and use the minimum wage for the bits it's good at, but don't expect it to do things it's not good at.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Question here from David Shand. What is the general impact of a minimum wage or an increase in the minimum wage on wages in general across the economy? Julie, do you want to take that one?
So what we've seen some really good work that Dave Murray and Dean Hislop have done, and what they've found is that minimum wage increases in New Zealand have tended to lead to a compression of the wage distribution. So at the low end of the wage distribution, if you have somebody who is paid the minimum wage and the minimum wage goes up, there's sort of this clumping or clustering down that low end, and that can have problematic dynamic effects in the labour market, because I talk about Julie's family day today, but my brother's an engineer and he's struggling to get apprentices right now because, as he puts it, nobody wants to take on the health and safety risk or the cost of training when they can go stack shelves at Countdown and have a nice life and get paid minimum wage in decent terms. So it does sort of empirically, it's not impacting employment so far. And we say yet and so far because I think, like a lot of economists, we look at that 65% median wage figure and think, wow, maybe we're getting close to the point where we might start seeing those kinds of effects. But at the moment we're not, but we are seeing this compression of the wage distribution. And so if you think about it, if you're the person who's paid a little more than someone earning the minimum wage, it's kind of not very motivating if everyone's kind of bunching up behind you.
A related question, I think, to that one, and a couple I'll group together here. People are wanting, I guess, to sort of clarify. So they've heard you saying here that the currently it's high, 65% of the median. But Lyndon says, but we also have some of the highest housing and increasingly grocery costs. So what would it look like, or how would it sort of stack up if we measured it in regard to, I suppose, expenditure or cost of living factors like that? And relatedly, Alan asks, isn't our minimum wage very low at around 28,000 per annum? How does that compare with other countries? And she says the US. So, yeah, Peter, do you want to just clarify?
Yeah, look, there's some very important points there. And lies, damn lies, and statistics. It's quite clear that New Zealand is a low wage economy, and a low productivity economy as well. And every government since I've been here for 30 years has wanted to fix that. And I think at the end of the day, that's where things are going. There's probably the most prospect of improving living standards of people if we can improve wages across the board, and do it in a way that's based on productivity increases. But again, the point is very well made that in the current environment, I don't think anyone on the minimum wage with a single earner would qualify for a mortgage. to buy a house, and costs are going up. And so if you're just looking at the cost of living side of it, then that would suggest that maybe next year higher minimum wages would be called for if you're worried about that bottom end of the Goldilocks range. But we'd like to have that compared with you know, what are the alternatives around increasing benefit levels for people who aren't employed? Is that a problem? Or increasing family tax, working for families tax credits? Is that a more effective way of addressing those real social concerns? We're not discounting those social concerns at all. They are very, very real. What we're saying is the minimum wage might not be the best of the alternatives to address that. And certainly you shouldn't say it's the only thing you can do. Governments can do a lot more than just the minimum wage.
Okay, one more question on this kind of theme, and then I'll move to a couple of slightly different ones. But Lily Engelbrecht asks, so her question is related to the price of goods moving up being due to the fact that the cost of labour has been underpriced. So she says, isn't it that the problem is not that the price of goods has gone up, leading to a cycle, but that the distribution of resources over the population doesn't support the ability of all wage earners to live reasonably? Julie, do you want to take that one?
I mean, other than saying, yes, it doesn't, you know, it doesn't, it just doesn't.
And I suppose
like I wish there was more to say on that point, but it's evident that it doesn't, and it's getting worse.
And that's why we need to be thinking across the range of policy. Options.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
And just quickly chiming in, it's why addressing inflation directly is really important. You know, inflation is really, really bad for the economy. It's particularly bad for low-income earners who are on fixed incomes. And so directly addressing that through monetary policy is something that's really important that the government and the Reserve Bank should be doing. And that's the ad for my next insight. But it will address this point of you know, inflation is bad, really bad for people. But we have a way of addressing it directly through monetary policy, which might be more effective than trying to fix inflation through increasing the minimum wage.
Hey, this is exciting. We've got a question from Amelia, who is a youth MP for this year, and the mock bill that they will be debating is apparently whether or not the minimum wage should be abolished. So that will be great. And Amelia, if you're listening, maybe you can put in the chat some information about when Youth Parliament is, or even a link to the bill, because that's exciting. And I'm sure people might be interested in watching that debate when it happens. But Amelia basically has asked you both for thoughts or opinions on that topic. So very effective way of doing her preparation for her, her speech in that debate. Thoughts about whether it should be abolished.
I'll go first.
So if you did, no, you won't. Sorry. So I just, one thing, which is if you think of the minimum wage as a floor to prevent exploitation, and you remove that, what does that job instead? That's my major concern with it. You look at some of the state minimum wages in the US are like $7 an hour, and they're in states where incomes are not high. But how does anyone function in a labor market where that's your hourly rate? So I guess the immediate reaction I have to that is, okay, well, if you're taking away the thing that's providing the floor, what is going to prevent exploitation?
Peter?
Sorry, Peter. I will be quiet.
I was just going to say no. Sorry, Amelia, it's going to be a short debate. Now, I think the economists always say, you know, compared to what? And you know, if you just repeal the minimum wage and did nothing else, that seems to be a simple answer. Don't do it. So the people proposing to repeal it, the question to ask them is, and replace it with what? that's always the hardest question. What's the alternative to what you're proposing, what you don't like? And I would, yeah, I'd absolutely love to hear that debate. And so if Amelia can provide some more information about that, that would be brilliant.
Yeah, please do if you can, Amelia. Okay, interesting question from Carol Beaumont, former MP, of course, who asks what other demographic information we have about who's on the minimum wage. So we talked about age in our conversation earlier, but what else do we know about the demographics of minimum wage earners and how long they spend on the minimum wage?
We don't know a lot about it, and we could know more. I don't think it's a gender issue too much. I think it's reasonably even, but there are a lot of in terms of proportions, but there are obviously a lot of women who are on minimum wage jobs, particularly in retail. One of the things we do know is the sectors in which it tends to be concentrated are generally low wage sectors. So retail, hospitality, agriculture, with seasonal pickers, they tend to be the people doing it. It's not much found in health professionals or in general services or in manufacturing. It's often concentrated in those industries. Age, yeah, we know a bit about. Spread across the country, it's pretty even. I don't think there's any great disparity, but we could know more. And the great question Carol asks is about, how long do people stay on it? And I think we need to do some more work on that to see what is the wage path. But certainly what we've got does suggest that there are some people who stay on the minimum wage for quite a long time, particularly adults. That it's not an entry wage; it's their wage.
I'd like to see more information on ethnicity as well.
I was going to say, do we know much about that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got some good news from Amelia that youth Parliament is taking place from the 18th to the 20th of July. The debates will all be on Parliament TV, and I'm dropping in a link to that bill that they will be debating if you'd like to check it out. So thank you, Amelia, for sharing that. And put it in your diaries, 18th to 20th of July. Let's go back to our questions. Laura Cole McLaughlin asks about regional variations. Is there merit in having regional variations of the minimum wage? I'll leave it up to you to decide.
And again, it's a question of what's it for. If you're using it to stop exploitation, then I'd say no, that exploitation is exploitation. It's just my chiming for my next seminar. And so, in that sense, you'd say no, it's probably something you want nationally. If you're doing it as a poverty alleviation issue, and that the costs of living vary from region to region, then you might look at some regional variances, like we do with, for example, the accommodation supplement that pays more in high cost areas. But again, it's a really good intro back into what's it for, what's it doing, and if it's mainly about exploitation, then I'd probably say no, that I don't think we should be allowed to exploit people more if they just happen to live in the regions.
Julie, anything to add to that?
I mean, that's what we see. If you think statewide in the US, we have variations from, I'm not across all of the data, but like around the New York state minimum wage is around $15 an hour, which reflects a much higher cost of living than, some states in the middle of the country, which are less than half that. So, when you have different, different governance structures, some places do elect to do that for a variety of reasons. But where you've got one national structure, I don't think it's a good idea. Like if it's something that's happening organically through people choosing to with, you know, to exercise their rights in a particular way, that's one thing. But I don't see different breakdowns in the regions being sensible in Aotearoa at all.
Okay. We've just got a few minutes left, and there's a question here. I think it's probably come through from someone watching live on our Facebook feed, which brings us back to the fears that we started with, because I'd like to finish off by looking at each of those fears and kind of giving an assessment on whether they're well-founded. So to lead us back there, this is a question about the political decision-making aspect. So given that we've talked about why that's unhelpful, do you have a preferred mechanism for setting the minimum wage? Would it be, for example, a tripartite process or a bipartisan agreement for indicative rates going forward for a number of years? Have you done any thinking or got any instinctive responses to that question?
Yeah, I mean, we have thought about it a little bit. I mean, in Australia, where I came from, for years, the minimum wage was set through the arbitration system, and that also got political, and the vote was always 2-1, and it depended on. So you had employers and unions would always be voting against each other, and the government would change from side to side. So, you know, the tripartite stuff might not necessarily do much. What I'd like to see is a lot more transparency around what the government's of the day's policy objectives are and what they are trying to achieve, and a bit more accountability around having to report when the minimum wage is increased, what happened last year. You know, and so whether it has to be annually, but certainly getting more information about the actual effects that the minimum wage has had on people's lives. So try and get that lived experience in there, don't just use data, but get that stronger sense of what actually happened. What did the government expect to happen? Were they pleasantly surprised, or were they unpleasantly disappointed with what they would do? And I think, you know, engaging civil society and the community and workers and employers more in the process, rather than just doing it in private.
Julie?
Sorry, I don't have anything to add. I think that was perfect.
Great. Okay, so look, we're going to finish in a moment, but before we do, I just want to revisit each of those 3 fears. So we had the fear that the setting of the minimum wage is politically motivated. On balance, I get the sense that you both feel like that is a well-founded fear that needs to be addressed in some way.
Yep. And look, you know, democracy is good, and competition of ideas is great. So I don't want to get to a situation where we just have a formula that does it automatically. You know, I think political parties should be talking about this and putting up their policies for debate. But I would like to see particularly more information around, more analysis of the effects, and perhaps a requirement that the government be more explicit about what it's using this tool for.
I'd also like to see more sort of dynamic assessments, you know, who is on this minimum wage and how long are they on it for, and are they coming on and going off, or are they on it for, you know, that kind of life cycle story isn't really in the discussions that we're having right now, and I think that's something that's important that we're missing. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, the second fear is that if we increase it, we're going to lose jobs. Quick final response from each of you on that one.
I mean, if we keep going, there's a point at which we're going to step off the cliff. We just don't know when that's going to happen. Like it just can't keep going. Do you think so, Peter?
Absolutely. And, you know, you hear occasionally people say, oh, if the minimum wage is so great, why don't we put it up to $100 an hour? And, you know, our point is, no, that would obviously be detrimental to the economy. That would cost a lot of jobs. It's finding that range and being more confident about the boundaries of that range. And, you know, is there a cliff, or is it a gentle slope? Economics tends to suggest gentle slopes. that the economies don't just stop one Tuesday. But, you know, I think the fear, the way I'd say it is that it's something to be worried about. It's something to keep under careful scrutiny, but keeping within a range that's about what we talk about should be, we should be safe there.
Great. And finally, the final fear, if it's not set appropriately, there's major, or if it's set too low, that there's wellbeing impacts. So again, I think we've covered that quite comprehensively in terms of the need for a wide range of other policy interventions to make sure we're capturing that. But any final things you want to add on that final point?
Oh, I think the point is that you know, it's a Goldilocks policy, not too high, not too low. There's a sweet spot in between, and that's what we've got to find. And we've got to, as long as we remember that, then the minimum wage will be doing what it's good at.
We need to think about employers here too. I mean, employers have had COVID lockdowns, they've had, you know, challenges getting workers, they've had supply of other goods and services, prices going up. It's a tricky balance between, you know, if you're in business, you ought to be able to pay your workers a decent wage, but at the same time, these are people who are struggling to get by themselves as employers. So that's when you're thinking about the appropriate level of the wage being in the sweet spot. You know, employers aren't people with bottomless pockets that can just continually, you know, pay people more that they would like to. It's, you know, it's a balancing act, and that's again kind of coming back to that point about, you know, not too high, not too low. Think about both sides and both players here.
And indeed, with the right kind of suite of policies, those employers stand to benefit also. Yeah.
As well. Yeah.
Right. Look, thank you. That's been a fascinating discussion, and I'm really pleased that we were able to get through many of the questions from our audience. There were still many more we didn't get to, and so my apologies to those who have asked really good questions that we haven't had time to get to. One way to answer them might be to download Peter and Julie's paper, which is in the chat, and have a read of it. It's a quick read. It's really interesting and really worthwhile if you're interested in these things. And I'd encourage you also to, as Peter said at the start, check out the other research, and also check out our research at the Helen Clark Foundation. We published in partnership with NZIER a paper on inclusive growth, which touched on aspects of the minimum wage policy as well last year. That's by Todd Kriebel. It's called Gains for Everyone. That's available on our website as well, along with all of our other research that we've published in the last couple of years. So I do encourage you to check those out. And if you like our work and you're interested in supporting the foundation, we'd love you to consider becoming a member. The support of our members really keeps us functioning, keeps us going day to day. So thank you so much to all of you who are members for your support. And let's finish now with karakia that acknowledges the work and the conversation that we've had and sends us on the way for a good afternoon. So ka whakairea te tapu kia wātia ai te ara, kia tū riki whakataha ai, kia tū riki whakataha ai, hui e, tai ki e. Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you, Julie and Peter. Kia ora.